Silas Blackwood had always known the land would shape his fate, but nothing in his past could have prepared him for the day the wind changed, and the world he knew began to unravel in fire and smoke. For 15 years since, that day had been the silent, ever-present ghost in his life, a shadow that clung to the rough-hewn logs of his cabin on Granite Ridge and whispered through the pines in the dead of winter. The mountains were his sanctuary and his prison, a vast, lonely cathedral where he served a penance for a sin he could never name but felt in the marrow of his bones. His life was a testament to order, a quiet rebellion against the chaos that had stolen everything from him. Each morning before dawn, he would rise, the cold floorboards a familiar shock to his bare feet. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, stoking the embers in the stone hearth, setting a pot of coffee to boil, the bitter aroma the only companion to greet the new day. His days were measured by the sun's arc across the sky and the tasks it illuminated, checking the trap lines that snaked through the dense forest, skinning and curing the pelts with methodical precision, mending his worn buckskins with stitches that were strong, if not elegant. His cabin, though small, was immaculate. Tools hung in their designated places, jars of preserves stood in neat rows on the shelves, and the floor was swept clean of every stray piece of dirt. It was the only world he could control. But the silence was a living thing. It pressed in on him during the long, snowbound winters and hummed with the drone of insects in the sweltering summer heat. In the silence, the memories returned. The smell of burning pine, a scent that should have been comforting but was now a harbinger of doom. The high, thin scream of his younger sister. Cut short. The sight of his father, a strong, capable man, rendered helpless by a wall of flame, and his own failure. The paralysis of a 10-year-old boy who had done nothing but watch. The townsfolk of Stone's Crossing had looked at him with pity then, the lone survivor, the orphan. But as the years passed, pity curdled into suspicion, then into the kind of weary disregard reserved for things best left forgotten. He was the hermit of Granite Ridge, a ghost story parents told their children, a man more myth than flesh. It was after a particularly brutal winter, one that had kept him snowed in for 3 straight months with only the howling wind for company, that the loneliness finally became a physical ache, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of hard work could fill. He found himself talking to his mule, a grizzled creature named Absalom, and listening for an answer. One evening, staring into the dancing flames of his hearth, he saw not the ghosts of his past but the specter of his future, a long, unbroken line of silent days stretching into an equally silent grave. The thought spurred him to an action so out of character it felt like a betrayal of the life he had so carefully constructed. He took out a piece of parchment, a quill, and a pot of ink. His hand, calloused and more accustomed to the heft of an axe, felt clumsy as it formed the letters. He wrote to a marriage broker in a city 2 territories away, a name he'd seen advertised in an old newspaper. His words were sparse and practical. He described his homestead, his trade, his solitude. He did not ask for beauty or youth or romance. The very idea was foreign to him. He asked for a partner, a widow, perhaps, someone who understood loss and did not fear silence, someone with steady hands and a quiet heart, who would not be frightened by the shadows on his soul or the remoteness of his mountain. He sealed the letter, a strange mix of hope and shame churning in his gut. For 6 months, the silence remained unbroken, and he began to believe it was a fool's errand, a momentary lapse in the discipline that had kept him sane. Then, a letter arrived with the weekly supply wagon, informing him that a bride had been found and would be arriving on the afternoon stagecoach on the first Tuesday of October. That Tuesday arrived under a sky the color of faded denim, the autumn air crisp with the promise of coming cold. Silas spent the morning in a state of anxious preparation that was entirely new to him. He scrubbed his hands until they were raw, trimmed his thick, dark beard with a pair of shears, and wrestled his unruly hair into submission with a wet comb. He even retrieved his Sunday coat from the wooden chest where it had lain for years, brushing away the scent of mothballs and pressing it as best he could with a warm flatiron. His stomach churned with each step his mule, Absalom, took down the winding trail toward Stone's Crossing. The familiar path seemed alien, every rock and tree a silent witness to his folly. As the first buildings of the town came into view, the general store, the assayer's office, the spire of the church reaching for the sky, his throat tightened. He could see them already, the townsfolk, gathering near the stage depot like crows sensing a spectacle. News traveled on the wind in a place like Stone's Crossing, and the impending arrival of the hermit's mail-order bride was the most tantalizing piece of gossip they'd had in years. He dismounted stiffly, his boots crunching on the packed dirt as he tied Absalom to the hitching post. The mule snorted, more at ease than its master. Whispers followed him like burrs on a blanket as he made his way to the wooden platform. "There he is," someone muttered. "Crawled down from his mountain at last." Another voice, sharp with derision, snickered. "Reckon any woman desperate enough to answer his ad knows what she's getting into." His ears burned, but he kept his gaze fixed on the rutted road, his hands clutching the brim of his hat, twisting it between his calloused fingers. The distant rumble of wheels and the thunder of hooves announced the stagecoach's arrival. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. The coach, a lumbering beast caked in the dust of 1,000 miles, lurched to a stop in a cacophony of rattling chains and groaning wood. "Passengers for Stone's Crossing?" the driver called out, his voice hoarse. The crowd pressed closer, a sea of curious, judging faces. Silas felt the weight of their collective gaze, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. He stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly, as he waited for his first glimpse of the woman who was to be his wife. The coach door creaked open. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a figure emerged, tentatively, struggling with the high step. It was not the mature, practical widow he had envisioned. It was a girl, barely on the cusp of womanhood, her form shrouded in a faded blue dress that strained at the seams, its fabric worn thin with time and hardship. She was severely overweight, her movements clumsy and uncertain. Dark, unkempt hair escaped from beneath a worn bonnet as she clutched a battered carpet bag in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other. A profound silence fell over the crowd, a collective intake of breath. Sharp and shocked, it lasted only a second before it shattered, breaking not into applause or welcome, but into a wave of poorly concealed titters and cruel, open laughter. A group of boys on the boardwalk began to point and jeer, their voices high and merciless. The girl, she couldn't have been more than 17, visibly flinched, her shoulders hunching as if trying to shrink into herself. A deep, painful blush spread from her neck to her round cheeks, a crimson tide of shame. "That's his bride," someone whispered loudly, the words dripping with malicious glee. "Poor fool got swindled proper." Another voice, a rough cackle from the direction of the saloon, added, "Looks like he ordered 2 wives in one." Silas stood rooted to the spot, a storm of emotions warring within him. There was shock, sharp and cold, at the sight of this child. There was the bitter sting of his own disappointment, a selfish pang he was immediately ashamed of. And then, rising above it all, was a hot, fierce anger at the broker who had deceived him, anger at the circumstances that had delivered this frightened girl to his doorstep, but most of all, a white-hot rage at the casual cruelty of the crowd. He had prayed for a companion, for an end to his loneliness. Instead, God had sent him a child, one clearly carrying a burden of shame as heavy as any he had ever known. The girl's eyes, wide and terrified, darted around the hostile faces before finally settling on him. A flicker of recognition crossed her face as she took in his tall frame and his dark Sunday coat. Her fingers tightened on her bag as she took a hesitant step forward. "Mr. Blackwood?" Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling like an aspen leaf in the wind. "Yes, miss." He managed to force the words past the knot in his throat, acutely aware that every eye was watching, every ear was listening, savoring their awkward exchange. She held out the sealed envelope. "From Reverend Matthews." She stammered, He said to give you this straight away." Silas accepted the letter, his fingers brushing against hers. Her hand was shaking violently. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the exhaustion etched into her young features. Whatever had led her to this moment, it had not been kind. More laughter erupted from the group of boys. One of them made an exaggerated waddling motion, sending his friends into fits of cruel hysterics. The girl's lower lip began to tremble, and a single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. And in that moment, something inside Silas shifted. The ghost of his own past rose up, vivid and painful. He saw himself again, a 10-year-old boy covered in soot, standing numbly before the smoldering ruins of his home, while the same kind of whispers, the same pointing fingers, had surrounded him. He had been alone then, an object of morbid curiosity and whispered speculation. He saw that same desolation, that same profound abandonment, reflected in this girl's tear-filled eyes. This was not what he had wanted, not what he had asked for, but the raw, vicious cruelty being directed at this vulnerable young woman struck at the very core of his being, against the silent code of honor that had been forged in the crucible of his own suffering. Without conscious thought, without a second of hesitation, he moved. He stepped between her and the jeering crowd, his large frame a sudden shield, blocking her from their view. He looked down at her bowed head and trembling shoulders. "Miss," he said, his voice rough but steady. He realized he didn't even know her name. "Alara," she supplied softly, her voice choked with tears. "Alara Vance." "Miss Vance," Silas said, his voice gaining strength. He gently took the battered carpet bag from her white-knuckled grip. "My mule is just over here. It's a long ride up to the cabin, but he's steady on his feet." Relief, pure and overwhelming, flooded her face at this simple act of kindness, though the fear still lingered in the depths of her eyes. She followed him away from the depot, head bowed, each step careful, as if she expected the very ground to reject her. The whispers and laughter followed them, a persistent, buzzing swarm. But Silas ignored them. His duty, in that moment, was clear. This girl, this Alara, had been placed in his care. As he helped her onto Absalom's back, he felt a surge of protective defiance. The crowd wanted a spectacle. They wanted to see him reject her, to add his own shame to hers, to confirm their judgment of them both as outcasts. He would not give them the satisfaction. He took her small, soft hand in his own calloused one. She startled at his touch, looking up at him with wide, questioning eyes, in one fluid, decisive motion. Silas raised their joined hands high above their heads. Turning to face the stunned crowd, his voice, rarely used and rough from disuse, rang out clear and strong, echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. "This here's my wife." The declaration hung in the air like a thunderclap before a storm. The mockery died on their lips, replaced by a stunned, gaping silence. The townsfolk stared, their minds struggling to comprehend this unexpected act of defiance from the shy, solitary mountain man. Even the troublemakers by the saloon fell quiet, caught off guard. Silas held their gaze for a long moment, his expression fierce and unyielding. Then, he turned his back on them all, on their judgment and their cruelty. He took the mule's reins in his free hand and, without a backward glance, began to lead Alara Vance away from Stone's Crossing, up the winding trail toward the granite peaks that had for so long been his only home. It was a silent vow, a promise made not with words whispered in a church, but with a single defiant act under a hostile sky. It was a promise that would bind their fates together, for better or for worse. From that day forward, the journey up Granite Ridge was a long, winding ascent into silence. The sounds of stones crossing the laughter, the whispers, the judgment faded behind them, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of Absalom's hooves on the rocky trail and the sigh of the wind through the towering pines. Silas walked ahead, his back a broad, unreadable wall, the reins held loosely in one hand. He did not speak, and Alara, perched awkwardly on the mule's back, was grateful for it. Words had only ever brought her pain, and the silence, while heavy with unspoken questions, felt safer than any conversation she could imagine. She clutched the worn pommel, her body swaying with the mule's steady gait, and watched the world she had known disappear below. With every step upward, the air grew thinner, cleaner. The scent of dust and humanity gave way to the sharp, clean fragrance of pine and damp earth. Alara found herself studying the man leading her into this wilderness. His movements were sure-footed and economical, born of a lifetime spent navigating this terrain, He moved like a part of the landscape itself, as quiet and enduring as the ancient rocks that jutted from the mountainside. She replayed his declaration in her mind, the three words that had silenced a town. "This here's my wife." It had not been a declaration of affection, she knew. It was an act of defiance, a shield he had raised to protect her, but the gesture, so unexpected and powerful, had planted a tiny, fragile seed of something she had never known before, a sense of worth. They reached the cabin as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. It was a simple, sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a small covered porch. Neat stacks of firewood lined one wall, each log cut to a precise length. It was not a home, it was a fortress, built for solitude and survival. Silas helped her down from the mule, his hands strong and impersonal on her waist, and moved to light a lantern. As golden light spilled from the single window, Alara stepped inside, her heart sinking just a little. The interior was as stark as the man who inhabited it. A single room, impeccably clean but devoid of any softness. A narrow cot with a simple patchwork quilt stood in one corner, a solid wooden table with two chairs in the center. A well-worn Bible and a few other books rested on a shelf, next to an array of tools and dried goods. There were no curtains on the window, no rug on the floor, no hint that a life, rather than a mere existence, was lived here. The first few days passed in a silent, awkward dance. Alara, driven by a deep-seated need to prove she was not the useless burden her stepfather had always claimed her to be. Set to work, she did not ask for permission. She simply began. She found a broom and swept the floor until the planks shone. She took the simple ingredients from the shelves: flour, salt, dried beans, and transformed them into meals that filled the small cabin with the warm, comforting aromas of baking bread and simmering stew. She found Silas's mending basket, filled with buckskins torn by briars and shirts with missing buttons, and set about repairing them with tiny, neat stitches her mother had taught her. Her work was her language. Each swept floor and mended seam, a quiet plea. "Let me stay. I can be useful. I can be—" Silas watched her, his expression unreadable. He would return from checking his trap lines to find the cabin warm, a hot meal waiting on the table. He never offered praise, but he would eat every last bite, a silent acknowledgement of her effort. In return, he began to leave things for her on the table without a word. One morning, it was a small bundle of wild herbs whose leaves, when crushed, released a scent of mint and lemon. The next, it was a perfectly carved wooden spoon, its surface sanded smooth as river stone. He began to teach her, not with lectures, but with quiet demonstrations. He would lead her into the forest and point to a set of tracks in the soft earth, murmuring, "Deer, 2 does, and a fawn. Pass this way at sunrise." He showed her which berries were safe to eat, which mushrooms would kill a man, and how to find the North Star on a moonless night. Their relationship was built in this shared silence, a fragile bridge constructed of small, unspoken kindnesses. The first time the silence felt comfortable was a week after her arrival. They sat at the table, eating a stew she had made from a rabbit he had brought home. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside, the wind whispered through the pines. For the first time. The quiet between them was not heavy with awkwardness, but filled with a sense of peace. Alara found the courage to speak, her voice soft. "My stepfather. He always said I was just another mouth to feed." Silas looked up from his bowl, his gray eyes serious in the firelight. He was silent for a long moment before he responded, his own voice a low rumble. "Never had anyone to cook for before." It was not a compliment, not exactly, but it was an admission of need, a confession of his own loneliness. In that moment, they were no longer just a mountain man and a mail-order bride, but two solitary souls who had found a strange, unexpected solace in each other's presence. They were two people who had never truly been wanted, and in that shared understanding, a genuine bond began to form. That bond was tested one night when a new sound pierced the familiar quiet of the mountains. It was a low, mournful howl, closer than it should be. Alara froze, a half-peeled potato slipping from her fingers. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his expression calm but alert. He moved to the window, peering out into the inky darkness. "Stay away from the door," he said, his voice low and even. The howl came again, closer this time, a chilling sound that seemed to vibrate through the very logs of the cabin. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She could see a shadow moving just at the edge of the firelight's reach. A sleek, dark shape with eyes that glinted like malevolent green sparks. A wolf. A primal, paralyzing fear seized her. Every story she had ever heard, every childhood nightmare, rushed into her mind. She was frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The wolf took another step closer, its head low, a growl rumbling deep in its chest. Silas moved without a sound. He took the heavy rifle from its pegs above the door, his movements fluid and certain. There was no panic in him, only a cold, focused purpose. He didn't aim to kill. He raised the rifle and fired into the air just above the creature's head. The gunshot was deafening in the stillness of the night, a violent explosion that ripped through the silence. The flash illuminated the wolf for a split second, its teeth bared. Its fur bristled before it yelped in terror and vanished back into the darkness. The echo of the shot rolled down the mountain. And then, silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Alara stood shaking, her legs trembling so badly she had to grip the table for support. The immediate danger was gone, but the terror remained, cold and clammy in her veins. She felt a wave of profound shame wash over her. She had been useless, a statue carved from fear. If Silas hadn't been there, she would have been helpless. He turned from the door, placing the rifle back on its pegs. He looked at her pale face and wide, frightened eyes. He didn't offer comforting words or a gentle touch. He simply stated a fact. The wilderness is not kind to the unprepared. His words, devoid of pity, struck her harder than any scolding. He was right. She had worked to make herself useful inside the cabin, but outside these four walls, she was still a liability. She was weak. That night, as she lay on her cot, listening to Silas's steady breathing from his bedroll by the door, a new resolve began to harden within her. The fear was still there, but now it was mingled with something else, anger. Anger at her own weakness, at the years of being told she was nothing. She would not be a victim. She would not be helpless. This mountain, this cabin, this quiet, complicated man, this was her home now, and she would learn to protect it. The next morning, as Silas prepared to check his lines, Alara stood before him, her hands clenched at her sides. "Teach me," she said, her voice quiet but firm, betraying none of the fear she still felt. Silas paused, turning to look at her. "Teach you what?" "How to use that," she said, nodding toward the rifle on the wall. "Teach me so I'm not unprepared again." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps even respect, passed through his eyes. He studied her for a long moment, then gave a single, decisive nod. It was another vow, another unspoken promise. The seed of hope that had been planted in the dust of Stone's Crossing had survived its first frost. And now, in the barren soil of her past, it was beginning to grow. True to his nod. The lessons began the following day. Silas started not with the rifle, but with the weight of it, teaching Alara how to hold it until her arms stopped trembling, how to brace the stock against her shoulder so it felt like an extension of her own body. He was a patient, methodical teacher, his instructions sparse but precise. "Breathe out as you squeeze," he would say, his voice a low murmur against the vast mountain silence. "Don't pull, squeeze, slow and steady." Her first shots were wild, kicking up dirt far from the tin can he had placed on a stump. The explosive crack of the rifle made her flinch every time, her eyes shutting instinctively against the noise and recoil. Yet, she did not give up. Every day, after their chores were done, they would stand in the clearing, and she would practice until her shoulder ached and her ears rang. Weeks turned into a month, and the harsh edges of their arrangement began to soften. The cabin, once a stark fortress of solitude, now held the lingering scent of baking bread and the quiet hum of Alara's presence. She had stitched simple curtains for the window from an old flour sack, a small touch that seemed to capture the morning light and hold it within the room. Silas, in turn, had built her a small shelf by her cot, a place for the few possessions she owned. Their shared silence was no longer awkward but companionable, punctuated by the steady rhythms of their life together, the thud of his axe splitting wood, the gentle scrape of her spoon in a pot, the rustle of pages as he helped her sound out words from his Bible in the evenings. The fear that had once defined Alara's existence was slowly being replaced by a quiet competence, and the profound loneliness that had haunted Silas for 15 years began to recede, like a tide pulling away from a long-forgotten shore. The peace was shattered on a crisp autumn afternoon when the air was sharp with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. A sound, unfamiliar and unwelcome, drifted up the trail, the steady, confident clip-clop of a shod horse. It was not the plodding gait of a farmer's mule or the weary tread of a prospector's nag. This was the sound of a horse well-fed and well-ridden, a sound that belonged to the world below. Silas, who had been sharpening his skinning knife on the porch, went still. He rose slowly, his hand resting on the axe propped against the cabin wall. His eyes narrowed on the bend in the path. Alara appeared in the doorway behind him, wiping her hands on her apron, her face clouded with a shared sense of unease. The rider who emerged from the trees was a stark contrast to the rugged wilderness around him. He was a man dressed in a tailored city coat, his boots polished to a high sheen, his face clean-shaven and framed by dark, oiled hair. He sat atop a fine black mare with an air of effortless ownership, as if the entire mountain was merely a part of his vast estate. He reined in his horse at the edge of the clearing and surveyed the cabin, his lips curling into a faint, dismissive smile. "Silas Blackwood, I presume," he called out, his voice smooth and cultured, yet carrying an unmistakable edge of command. Silas did not answer immediately. He simply stood, a silent, formidable obstacle. The man dismounted with practiced ease and strode forward, his polished boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. "My name is Jedediah Thorne," he said, stopping a few feet from the porch. His eyes flickered past Silas to Alara, lingering on her for a moment, with an appraising look that made her skin crawl. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "This is my land," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "Nothing here belongs to you." Thorne chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I'm not talking about the land, my good man. I'm talking about the girl." He produced a folded document from his inner coat pocket, flicking it open with a snap of his wrist. "A contract," he explained, his smile widening. "Signed and witnessed. It seems the girl's stepfather, a man of rather poor financial habits, owed me a considerable sum to settle this debt. He signed over his stepdaughter's indenture. She is bound to me until her 18th birthday, to work in my establishment in Stone's Crossing." Alara felt the blood drain from her face. She knew of Jedediah Thorne. He owned the Gilded Cage, the largest saloon in town, a place whispered about for its rough clientele and the questionable virtue of the women who worked there. This was not a contract for honest labor. It was a sentence to a life of degradation. "This paper is worthless here," Silas said, his knuckles white where he gripped the axe handle. "On the contrary," Thorne countered smoothly. "It is a legally binding document. I am her legal guardian until the debt is settled or her term is served. I've come to collect my property." The way he said the word property, letting it hang in the air, was a deliberate and calculated cruelty. He was not just a creditor, he was a predator, and he was enjoying their fear. Silas took a half-step forward, a dangerous light glinting in his eyes. But Thorne simply raised a calming hand. Now, let's not be hasty. I'm a reasonable man. I can see she's settled in. I'll give you a week. 1 week to bring her down to the Gilded Cage. If you fail to comply, I'll return with the law, and they will be far less pleasant about it than I am." Without waiting for a reply, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a profound and venomous silence in his wake. The threat hung over the cabin like a shroud. The easy companionship they had built was replaced by a tense, gnawing anxiety. Every snapping twig in the forest, every howl of a distant coyote, made Alara jump. Silas grew even more quiet, a storm of controlled fury brewing behind his stoic expression. They knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Their supplies of flour and salt were dwindling, and winter was approaching. They had to go to town. The day they rode down the mountain, the air was heavy with unspoken dread. When they entered the mercantile, the familiar smell of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples did nothing to soothe their nerves. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, stood behind the counter, his face grim, and standing near the back, by the barrel of pickles, was Jedediah Thorne. He was not there by accident. He gave them a slow, triumphant smile. Silas placed his list on the counter. "We need flour, salt, and coffee," he said, his voice flat. "Mister." Henderson wrung his hands, his eyes darting nervously toward Thorne. "I'm sorry, Silas," he mumbled, not meeting his gaze. I can't sell you anything. Your credit is no good here anymore." "I'm paying with cash," Silas said, placing a small leather pouch of coins on the counter. Thorne let out a soft laugh. "It's not about the money, Blackwood. It's about a man's reputation, and yours. Seen in the company of a runaway indentured servant is not one a respectable businessman can afford to be associated with." The humiliation was public and absolute. The few other customers in the store averted their eyes, their silence a form of complicity. Thorne had poisoned the well, turning the entire town against them. There was nothing to do but leave. They walked out onto the boardwalk, the weight of their defeat a physical burden. They were truly alone, outcasts with nowhere to turn. As Silas moved to untie Absalom, a woman stepped out from the alleyway beside the store. It was Mrs. Peterson, a stern-faced farmer's wife whose husband worked a small claim upriver. She was a woman known for her sharp tongue and no-nonsense demeanor. She glanced around quickly, then pressed a heavy cloth bundle into Alara's hands. "It's not much," she whispered, her voice rough but not unkind. "Potatoes and some salted pork. A man like Thorne doesn't own the whole world. Not yet." Before Alara could stammer her thanks, Mrs. Peterson had disappeared back into the shadows. They rode back up the mountain in silence. But this time, the silence was different. It was not born of awkwardness or fear, but of a deep, shared contemplation. Thorne had shown them the depth of his cruelty, and the town had shown them its cowardice. But one woman, with a simple, defiant act of kindness, had shown them something else. She had shown them that they were not entirely alone. Back in the cabin, Alara placed the bundle on the table and carefully unwrapped it. The potatoes were small and misshapen, the pork salty and tough. But to her, in that moment, it was the most beautiful feast she had ever seen. It was not just food, it was a flicker of light in a vast and encroaching darkness. It was hope. The hope Mrs. Peterson had given them was a fragile, flickering candle in the vast darkness of their predicament. In the days that followed their humiliating retreat from Stone's Crossing, the small bundle of potatoes and salted pork felt like both a blessing and a countdown. It was sustenance, but it was finite. The threat of Jedediah Thorne was no longer a distant storm cloud on the horizon. It was a palpable presence, a poison that had seeped into the very air they breathed. Winter was gathering its forces in the high peaks, a silent, creeping army of cold, and their larder was perilously low. The week Thorne had given them came and went, each sunset a small victory, each sunrise a fresh wave of anxiety. He did not return, but his absence was more menacing than his presence. It was a game of cat and mouse, and they were trapped on the mountain, waiting. The change in the weather came without warning. One morning, the sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, took on a strange, bruised yellow hue. The air grew heavy and still, the usual chorus of birdsong falling silent. A deep, unnatural cold began to settle over the ridge, a cold that felt different from the crisp bite of autumn. It was a damp, bone-deep chill that promised something more sinister. Silas stood on the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the air. "Snow," he said, his voice a low rumble of concern. "A bad one, and coming on fast." He knew they were unprepared. The last of their flour was gone, and the salted pork was a memory. Their survival through the winter depended on the game in his traps. Driven by a grim sense of urgency, he made a decision. "I have to check the far lines," he announced. pulling on his heaviest coat. "Up by the northern pass, it's our best chance for a good catch before this storm locks us in." Alara watched him, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The sky looked angry, and the stillness of the forest felt like a held breath before a scream. "Is it safe?" she asked, her voice small. "It has to be," he replied. His jaw set. He checked his rifle, slung a small pack over his shoulder, and with a final, lingering look at her. He stepped out into the unnerving quiet and was quickly swallowed by the pines. The first flakes began to fall an hour later, not the gentle, drifting kind, but small, hard pellets that hissed as they hit the ground. The wind began to rise, at first a low moan through the trees, then a shrieking, violent gale that clawed at the cabin, rattling the window and finding every crack in the log walls. The world outside dissolved into a churning vortex of white. Alara paced the small room, her gaze constantly drawn to the window, where she could see nothing but the furious, blinding snow. Every gust of wind sounded like a predator trying to claw its way in, and with every passing hour. The knot of fear in her chest grew tighter. Miles away, Silas was fighting a losing battle against the blizzard. The trail had vanished, and the wind drove the snow into his face with the force of tiny needles, blinding him. He had checked 2 traps, both empty, and knew he had to turn back. The snow was already knee-deep, each step a monumental effort. He was pushing his way through a thicket of young aspens when he heard a sharp, sickening crack from above. He looked up just in time to see a massive pine branch, heavy with wet, clinging snow, breaking free. He threw himself to the side, but he wasn't fast enough. The branch, a true widowmaker, crashed down, missing his head but pinning his left leg to the frozen ground with an explosion of agonizing, white-hot pain. For a moment, the world went black. When he came to, the pain was a living thing, a fire consuming his leg. He was trapped, the immense weight of the branch crushing his limb against a hidden rock. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to take hold, but he fought it back with the iron will of a survivor. He lay in the snow, the blizzard raging around him, and began the slow, torturous process of freeing himself. It took him what felt like an eternity, his knife sawing at the smaller branches, his body straining against the weight, until finally, with a surge of adrenaline and a scream that was stolen by the wind, he pulled his leg free. It was a mangled, useless thing, the bone clearly shattered. He knew then that his chances of survival were slim, but the image of Alara, alone in the cabin, waiting, rose in his mind. He would not die here. He began to crawl. It was nearly dark when a faint scratching sound at the door cut through the howl of the storm. Alara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She thought of the wolf, of Thorn, of all the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth and crept toward the door. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. A low groan was the only answer. Recognizing the sound, she threw the door open. Silas collapsed over the threshold, a broken, half-frozen man, dragging his ruined leg behind him, leaving a dark trail in the snow. For a heartbeat, Alara was paralyzed by sheer terror. He was pale as death, his lips blue, his clothes frozen stiff. But then something shifted inside her. The fear was still there, but it was pushed aside by a cold, fierce wave of determination. This was not the time for weakness. She slammed the door against the storm and, with strength she didn't know she possessed, dragged him across the floor, away from the biting cold, closer to the life-giving warmth of the hearth. Her training, born of Silas's quiet lessons and her own resolve, took over. Her first thought was the fire. It was the heart of their world, and it was dying. The wind, finding its way down the chimney, was sucking the heat from the room. She worked frantically, piling on logs, using the bellows to coax the embers back to a roaring blaze. Only when the cabin was filled with a steady, dancing light did she turn her full attention to Silas. She cut away his frozen trousers with his skinning knife, her hands surprisingly steady. The sight of his leg made her stomach lurch. It was swollen to twice its normal size, bent at an unnatural angle, the bone protruding through the skin in a gruesome, open wound. She remembered her mother, tending to farmhands who had been kicked by mules or caught in machinery. She remembered the calm, competent way her mother would clean a wound, her voice low and soothing. Alara took a deep breath and became that woman. She heated water, tore strips from her cleanest petticoat for bandages, and found his small bottle of whiskey. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, her touch methodical, her mind focused. Silas was delirious, muttering names she didn't recognize, his body shivering with fever. She knew she had to set the bone, using 2 flat pieces of wood from a broken crate as a splint. She took a deep breath, gripped his leg, and pulled. The sound of the bone grating back into place was horrific, and Silas cried out, a raw animal sound of pure agony, before passing out completely. The night was a long, desperate vigil. Alara kept the fire roaring, bathed Silas's brow with cool water, and listened to the storm rage outside. She felt an exhaustion so profound it was a physical weight, but she refused to succumb to it. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hours before dawn, a new sound joined the symphony of the storm, a heavy, scratching sound at the door, followed by a low, guttural snuffle. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't a wolf. This was heavier, more powerful. The scratching grew more insistent, and then a tremendous weight slammed against the door, making the entire cabin shudder. A bear, driven from its den by the storm and drawn by the scent of blood. The old, familiar terror rose in her throat, choking her. She was alone. The man who had protected her was helpless, but as she looked at the rifle on the wall, she heard Silas's voice in her mind. Calm and steady. Breathe out as you squeeze. Don't pull. Squeeze. She was not the same girl who had frozen in fear at the sight of a wolf. She was a woman who had set a broken bone, who had fought a blizzard, who was keeping death at bay. She took the rifle from its pegs. It was heavy, but the weight felt familiar now, reassuring. She moved to the window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Through a small patch she had cleared in the frost, she saw a massive, dark shape, its fur matted with snow, its small, intelligent eyes fixed on the door. It rose on its hind legs, a terrifying silhouette against the swirling snow, and slammed its weight against the door again. The wood groaned, the latch straining. In that moment, Alara knew she had only one chance. She raised the rifle, bracing the stock against her aching shoulder. Just as Silas had taught her, she didn't aim at the bear, she aimed above it, at the dark, indifferent sky. She breathed out, squeezed the trigger, and the world exploded in a flash of light and a deafening roar. The bear dropped to all fours with a startled huff, shook its massive head. And then, with a final, resentful glance at the cabin, it lumbered off into the blizzard and was gone. Alara leaned against the wall, the rifle still clutched in her hands, and slid to the floor, her body finally succumbing to the tremors of adrenaline and exhaustion. She had done it. She had faced the wilderness, and she had won. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Buried under a thick, silent blanket of white, the sun rose on a landscape of pristine, breathtaking beauty, inside the cabin. Silas's fever had broken. He was weak, but he was lucid, his eyes following her as she moved about the room. He looked at her, at the rifle leaning against the wall, at the neatly bandaged leg, and a new understanding dawned in his gaze. Later that day, another figure appeared, struggling through the deep snowdrifts. It was Reverend Miller from Stone's Crossing, his face etched with worry. "I feared the worst for you both," he said, accepting a cup of hot coffee from Alara's hand. After checking on Silas, he turned to Alara, a serious expression on his face. "I have news. I was in the next territory over before the storm hit, in the town of Flat River. I was speaking to the minister there, and I mentioned your name. Alara, an old woman in his parish, a Mrs. Gable, overheard. She said she knew your mother. She said she was there the day you were born." A spark of hope, fierce and bright, ignited in the quiet cabin. A witness. Someone who could refute Thorne's claims. Someone who could prove the truth. Silas pushed himself up on his elbows, his face pale but his eyes burning with a new fire. He looked at Alara, not as a fragile girl he needed to protect, but as the woman who had just saved his life. Their relationship had been forged anew in the crucible of the storm. They were no longer protector and protected. They were partners. "We have to go," Silas said, his voice raspy but firm. "As soon as I can ride." His trial by fire was over. Hers had just made her who she was meant to be. Now, their fight for survival was about to become a fight for justice. The reality of Silas's injury was a heavy, unyielding anchor. His will was iron, but his body was broken. For days, he fought a silent, stubborn war against his own limitations, his frustration a palpable storm within the quiet cabin. Every failed attempt to put weight on his splinted leg was a fresh torment. Alara became his gentle, unmovable warden. She tended to his leg with a practiced competence that belied her years, changing the bandages and applying poultices of herbs she gathered from the snow-dusted forest floor. She met his impatient arguments with a quiet, firm resolve. "You will be of no use to me or to this missus. Gable if you arrive half dead," she stated. Her voice soft but leaving no room for debate. The dynamic had shifted completely. The seasoned survivor was now the one cared for, and the frightened girl his steadfast guardian. Reverend Miller promised his aid before departing, his presence a calm and reassuring buffer against the world's hostility. On the fourth day, leaning heavily on a crude crutch he had carved, Silas declared it was time. Their farewell on the morning of his departure was heavy with unspoken fears. The snow had melted under a weak sun, leaving the world a muddy, treacherous landscape. Alara packed a satchel for him and the Reverend with smoked rabbit, hard biscuits, and a small flask of whiskey. As he prepared to mount Absalom with the Reverend's help, he turned to her. The rifle was propped by the door, a silent sentinel. "Keep it close," he said, his voice low and serious. "Don't open the door to anyone you don't know. Thorn is a snake. He may think you are vulnerable with me gone." Alara met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "I am not the same woman who stepped off that stagecoach." "Silas," she replied softly, "this is my home. I will protect it." Seeing the truth of her words in the set of her jaw, he simply nodded, a profound sense of pride swelling in his chest, and turned his horse toward the valley. The journey to Flat River was a slow, arduous affair. Every jolt of the mule sent a fresh wave of agony up Silas's leg, but he bore it with a stoic silence, his focus fixed on the goal ahead. They found the witness, Mrs. Gable, in a small cabin at the edge of the weary town. But fear had preceded them. A shudder fell over the old woman's features as she tried to close the door. "He was already here," she whispered, terrified. "A well-dressed man with eyes like a snake. He told me old stories are best left buried, and that those who dig them up often end up buried as well." Thorn had anticipated them. The realization was a cold stone in Silas's gut, while the Reverend spoke gently. Silas stepped forward on his crutch. He did not threaten. He spoke of Alara, of her kindness, her courage during the storm, appealing to the memory of Mrs. Gable's friendship with Alara's mother. Tears welled in the old woman's eyes. Her conscience won over her fear. She provided a sworn statement and, from a dusty chest, a thin, leather-bound ledger. "My husband was the clerk," she explained, tracing a line of faded ink. "He kept meticulous records. Here it is, the loan Alara's stepfather took from Thorn. It was a pittance. The contract Thorn holds is a monstrous forgery. It was the proof they needed, the weapon to slay the dragon." Back on Granite Ridge, Alara worked with a focused energy. She was alone, but not lonely, the rifle never far from her side. She was splitting kindling when she heard the confident approach of a shod horse. Her heart gave a single, hard thud, but she did not run. She calmly walked to the porch, picking up the rifle. Jedediah Thorn reined in his mare, a cruel smirk on his face, expecting to find a cowering girl. Instead, he found a woman. "Your mountain man has abandoned you, has he?" he drawled. "He has gone to find the truth," Alara said, her voice clear and cold. Thorn sneered, taking a step forward. "You belong to me, girl. There is no one to stop me." She did not shrink back. She raised the rifle, the movement smooth and deliberate. "This is my home," she said, her voice a low, dangerous register. "Leave now," he scoffed. "You wouldn't dare," and took one final step. The sharp metallic click of the rifle's hammer being cocked echoed in the mountain quiet. Her aim was steady, her eyes narrowed with a resolve as hard as granite. "I am not the one you should dare." "Mr. Thorn," she whispered. He saw it, then this was not a bluff. This was a woman who had faced down a blizzard and a bear. Fear flickered in his eyes. He backed away, his arrogance shattered, and fled down the trail. Alara stood, rifle raised, until he was gone. Her body began to tremble, but her heart was soaring. She had defended her home. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, ready for the final battle. Alara stood on the porch, the rifle still warm in her hands. A deep, resonant calm replacing the trembling in her limbs long after Thorn's horse had faded into the silence. The return of Silas and Reverend Miller 2 days later was quiet, but their grim, hard-won victory was clear in the sworn statement and old ledger they carried. He saw the newfound steel in her spine. They had both faced their dragons and were ready for the final battle. The morning of the hearing, they rode to Stone's Crossing as partners marching toward a reckoning. The courthouse was buzzing, where Jedediah Thorn stood with a confident smirk, believing he had already won. Thorn presented his fraudulent contract with theatrical flair, speaking of law and order. The room was heavy with tension until Reverend Miller approached the bench. He presented Mrs. Gable's sworn statement, testifying to Alara's true age. And then the old mercantile ledger. "Here, Your Honor," he said, "is the truth of the debt. A loan of $5 for whiskey and tobacco." Thorn's smirk vanished, replaced by rage as he yelled, "Lies, forgeries!" In that moment, a voice cut through the tension. "She's telling the truth." Mr. Peterson, the farmer, stood, his wife beside him. "We've known Thorn for years. We know his greed. And we've seen the character of this man and his wife." One by one, others began to stand the blacksmith, the livery owner, even Mr. Henderson from the mercantile, a quiet, powerful tide of support from a community finding its conscience. Judge Hammond's gavel cracked down. "Mr. Thorn," he said, his voice like chipping stone, "this court finds you guilty of fraud, coercion, and perjury. Sheriff, take this man into custody." As Thorn was led away, the judge turned to Silas and Alara, a hint of a smile on his lips. "I declare the indenture contract null and void. This marriage is lawful and binding. Let no man tear asunder what has so clearly been joined by a power greater than this court." A wave of relief washed over Alara, beside her. Silas released a breath he seemed to have been holding for months. The crowd, which had once met them with mockery, began to applaud. A warm, genuine ovation that filled the courthouse with a sound of redemption. They walked out into the bright sunshine, no longer outcasts, but members of a community that had chosen decency over fear. The story did not end there. It began, months later, as spring breathed new life into the mountains. The sound of hammers and cheerful shouts echoed across Granite Ridge. The town had come for a barn raising, men hoisting beams, women laying out a feast. Silas, his leg now healed, moved among his neighbors, a man at home in the world. Alara stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the scene with a full heart. She was no longer the frightened girl, but a cherished part of a community. Silas came to stand beside her, his arm wrapping gently around her waist. His hand moved to rest on her belly, where the gentle swell of new life was beginning to show. They had faced down the cruelty of the world and had been answered with kindness, looking out at their growing garden and the promise of their growing family. They knew they had finally found what they had both been searching for, a place to belong.